Now, there's a mega drought and super incredible hot temperatures down in the southeast U.S., but they keep getting the rain, which is the only saving grace. If the rain stops in the southeast U.S., the soybean crop is gone for the year, as well as peanut.
Adapt 2030 Mini Ice Age Conversations covers changes in our climate due to a new and intensifying grand solar minimum. In the media, overlooking, downplaying, or burying cold weather changes occurring on our planet. This is in order to keep the global warming agenda steaming full speed ahead. I do this podcast and radio program because we need to begin conversations on how to adapt our food growing strategies long before 2030 as agricultural zones shift, affecting global crop output, but very few mainstream media outlets are talking about the most important issue of our time, cold weather crop losses. Our sun is going through a 400-year cycle, which has effects on our weather patterns as our magnetosphere weakens and the jet streams go out of flow. It's not CO2, it's not you, it's the sun. Are you ready to thrive in the Grand Solar Minimum? Then join me for Mini Ice Age Conversations. I'm your host, David DuByne.
And I do welcome you this morning. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are on the planet. I'm your host, David DuByne, Mini Ice Age Conversations, creator of the Adapt 2030 channel on YouTube. Now, whether you know it or not, mark this day in history. This is the day that we're starting to enter the new world. Yesterday, we stepped out of the old world that we used to know and exist in. As I've been doing this, producing of videos, podcast of this grand solar minimum, and now it seems to be an intensification of the magnetic pole on our planet, shifting, wandering, and whatever you like to term it. Yesterday will go down in history as the day that the amount of food on this planet has shifted into a negative, and according to history, for the next 15 or 17 years, it is down from here. We will no longer have enough food to feed the planet. It won't be this year, but this is the first step down. And if you hadn't followed the futures market, if you hadn't been following the plantings, the fictitious numbers from the USDA, the real world on the ground accounts of what's happening versus what's being told in the greater mainstream media and the agricultural publications, which I'm now having a difficult time believing what they're putting out in terms of full plantings, etc. We've just stepped over the line. I want to talk about that today, as well as some different anomalies across the planet in terms of snow, cold, that they said would never happen. Remember, Al Gore told us snow would be a thing of the past. I always like to start with the biggest bang for the buck right here in the beginning. If you hadn't been following the futures market and following what's happening with corn futures, wheat futures, soya futures, literally the prices that you pay after that has been delivered from a farmer to a factory and the factory produces, and then it's delivered back to your supermarket. Now, the reason I bring it up, there was a massive spike, but there's been some pullback since that point. But the spike was massive, ferocious, and if you're looking at the way the market's moving, a lot of people position themselves to protect from losses. So the futures market in the beginning was based as a way for farmers to protect themselves and hedge. If prices rose or if prices fell, they could find themselves somewhere in the middle without going too much into debt. Now, you have to realize when that started, we're talking decades, plural, ago. But that too has been hijacked with paper trades and high-frequency trading and people out there just to scalp and vulturize, if there is such a word, prices and pump and dump markets for the gain.
And speaking of cycles, my new book with my co-author Bill Porter, Climate Revolution, a must-read for understanding our sun-driven climate. As we progress deeper into this new Eddy Grand Solar Minimum, weather extremes leading to global food scarcity and higher food prices are here now. This book describes the expected changes, how to survive and thrive during future challenging times, and also practical preparations. The entire book is interactive with over 250 links, so you can click and go out to the scientific aspect of what we're talking about with the repeating cycles in this grand solar minimum. The science is explained so you understand the mechanisms. The solutions are there because we know we're going to face these exact same problems again that were faced in the Maunder Minimum, the Sporer Minimum, the Wolf Minimum. Find designs for building greenhouses, grow guides, beam soil techniques, as well as bioreactors to create your own growth hormones for the soil. Available now, the new Adapt 2030 Climate Revolution. The link's in the description box below.
Great idea in the beginning to protect farmers, but what it's come to now is just a show, if you will. But here's the thing. There was 285,000 short calls out there. Now, going short means you think the price is going to drop. Put option. They switched. Over 50% of the traders in a day switched from short options to long call options. Call means going out in the future and you think the price is going to increase. Now, it went from 285,000 put option to less than 115,000 in a matter of a day. There was that much of a swing because the way it was explained is the United States Department of Agriculture, the USDA, had in the earlier forecast predicted that only 4 million acres would be offline. And when I say offline, I mean zero planting. The fields were too soggy, too wet. The massive floods that rolled down from Nebraska and Iowa decimated the fields. They were literally so log-strewn and chemically polluted that there was no way for them to plant. Now, that originally was 4 million acres, the USDA estimates. But then just in this last week, they brought that up to, sit down for a second, 13 million acres that will not be planted this year. Hence, everybody understands that there's not going to be nearly the amount of corn, wheat, or soy forecast. So in a supply-demand environment, prices are going to rise. What happened with the flooding also in the United States this year is at least 30% of all the stored grain that we had in America got washed away. And if you're not from the United States, that's an enormous amount because in the United States this year, there was more grain being stored because of the tariffs and the trade wars with China. So since they couldn't sell everything, they thought, hey, we'll just pack it up and store it because eventually China will start buying again. So it was just a matter of time to outweight the Chinese because their people need to eat. Their crop production has declined across the board, everything in China. Now, you know when the Chinese government comes out and shows a negative loss, a net loss for all the crops planted in the country, although they put it at just over 0.5%, it was 0.6. Now, what I found really quirky about the Chinese government statistics, corn was down 0.6, wheat was down 0.6, soybean was down 0.6. So interesting how everything was just down 0.6, a little over 0.5%. Now, you know if that's true, then it's probably 6% or more. Chinese government statistics are very shady at best. I'll use a polite term there. You can fill in your own other phrase that might mean manipulating the figures. But with Chinese government down, they're going to be searching for supplies. So what they've done is they knew this was coming up, so they stockpiled a bunch of food. They bought a whole bunch, pushed the prices down again, manipulating paper trades on the markets, and then they scarfed up a bunch, and now they told, okay, we got enough for this year, or at least these 6 months, and then they told Trump, see, they were going to try to play the game, like we have enough food for 6 months, we can push Trump over a barrel for 6 months, and then we can get our food imports back in about 6 months, and it'll look like we're the good guys. We pushed Trump back. We still had enough food to feed everybody, but oops, they made a big mistake. Now they're out on the markets looking for more food again, and the trade war still continues. And now we see these futures prices skyrocketing across the board for everything from the corn, the soy. We got barley spiking. So what this means for you and I is the amount of food grown this year is going to be nowhere where it was last year. So what they're going to have to do is pull into something called the carryover stocks. The carryover stocks are the amount of food that we have stored literally across the planet in different places. And if you go to the USDA, you can find a monthly production for individual crops across the planet. They go into oats, barley. They even have buckwheat, millet, these kind of obscure crops that we don't hear about too much. But everything is designated by carryover crop. Now this year, if you hadn't been paying attention, it decreased yet again and again. It's been decreasing for the last 3 years. Yet the media is telling we're having record production. So for me, it's kind of a disconnect where if we have this much extra production, then how are the carryover crops decreasing by millions of tons? So the last estimate was 260 million tons. Now we're waiting for the July to come out because then we'll really see how much was lost in the floods in America. There was a little delay on the agricultural inspection to know how much is really carried over from month to month. But since all these floods occurred, 2 months ago, it took them forever to get the inspectors in there. And what I'm seeing is still they're like 70% behind on inspection quota, or literally farmers asking to be inspected. Because when the grains were flooded, before they can sell them in the market, they have to have an inspector go out there and actually take a look at the grains and see if they were waterlogged, if they pulled off the top, if they can be blended. Blended just means, can you take what was grain that looks like it's good from a silo that was contaminated with water, and then can you put it into something like this year's new crop that looks almost 100% pristine? Can you blend those two together? Can you get a larger total by blending? And that's what they call that. Now, the problem was the silos, of course, or storage facilities, once they're wet in the bottom, since everything's 10% moisture or so, it can rehydrate itself. And they call that wicking, where the water in the bottom can get sucked up the column of grain, adding more water as the stuff rehydrates. And it could be corn, could be wheat. So the wicking, as it goes up the column, it eventually will stop where the gravity can't overcome. So if you're looking at something in a silo that's 200 feet tall, the wicking's not going to go up to the top 100 feet. It'll wick up to probably 40, 50 feet. And what they're trying to do is use vacuums and come in and take the tops of the grain storage facilities off and then pull that out of there with a vacuum. And when I say vacuum, I mean, don't put don't get your arm stuck in front of that thing. This is your industrial, like pulling out multi-tons of grain per second kind of vacuum. So what the USDA inspectors need to do is go back in. They vacuumed out the top whatever amount of feet off that, and then the USDA inspector needs to go in and then measure it and see if there was any contaminated water that came within, I think it's 12 feet is the minimum now, but I'm sure they're going to draw that down so they can get more grain out of there. So your health is not really an issue for them or safety concern. It's just about trying not to spook the markets, and if they need to reduce the buffer zone from the wicking wet up to the dry grains, they don't care. They'll probably bring it down to like 6-9 feet or something. But anyway, an inspector has to run in there and take a look and see, did they vacuum to the correct levels? Did they get any contaminated grain in there? Was there any extra wicking? Did they pull up contaminants inside? So they need to inspect everything, all the flooded farms, all the recycled grains, whatever. So they're 70% behind still on all the requests for this to be done. Now, with that being said, as we get to this new USDA report coming up here, we should get a good idea how much was lost for the carryover stocks there. But it was 230 million tons, which was down and down and down. So how do you, again, these losses for the last 3 years, and now it's down to 260 or 230, sorry, dropped from 260 to 230 just in the last, 6 months. That's a 30 million ton grain drawdown. So I'm thinking, they keep saying it's record harvest, but why do they keep drawing down the grain on the carryover stocks? So this year the forecast is for that thing to go skyrocketing down into the hundreds. From 230 down, it's going to be, so they're predicting somewhere around 170-ish, 175, but who knows? With the amount of losses, it could go down to 160 or further. But now you got to take into consideration, that's 1 year. The carryover stocks are going to be knocked that heavily. Now, they're not even taking into consideration the losses in the Ural Mountains, the losses in Australia, which I'll come to. Australia's become a net grain importer now, wheat importer. They're importing almost 1 million tons of grain. Importing, not exporting. Remember, Australia used to be a major exporter, but now because of the losses, which Kevin Long from the Long View down in Australia, he does crop forecasting for the southeast down there, Mallee and South Australia. He foresees another mega drought for the next 7 years. So even the production that's on tap right now for Australia is going to be lost even further. So Australian demands are going to continue to import. So we lost Australia. We lost South Africa completely due to politics. Where's next? Now we're looking at America, Canada, parts of the Ural Mountains offline. So the carryover stocks coming in, let's say it draws down to 170 this year. Well, next year we already know it's going to be less anyway. What if it draws down to let's say 110 the next year? And then it draws down to, say, 80 the following year. At what year do we roll over? We no longer have enough food in the carryover stocks where all we have is what we grow on the planet each year. That's predicted in 3 to 4 years from now. Now, depending on how this weather situation flares out here, and if it gets worse next year, this carryover stocks are going to be gone in 2.5 years, which means we will only have enough food to feed the world with what we grow in less than 3 years. And as the Grand Solar Minimum intensifies, and what we look in the past, and we look at the Maunder Minimum, the Sporer Minimum, the Wolf Minimum, the Oort Minimum, 800 AD. That was the collapse of the Tang Dynasty, by the way. Most powerful dynasty ever with the highest level of food growing. We saw the Incan Empire collapse. We saw the end of the classic Mayans at the same time. So whatever happened, that swept the planet. And they were really good. Like, everybody was an organic farmer at that time. They had incredible agricultural techniques using natural flow-throughs. They were decimated. Everything collapsed at that time. So for sure, as we look out, Maunder Minimum, Sporer Minimum, we saw the same thing. The grain production and food production declines during these times. That's just a general statement. Everything declines. And it kept declining year upon year upon year. So as we look back in history, and we see this happening again and again, this is just a standard thing that you can expect in the Grand Solar Minimum. It's not like some super magic or something. It is just history. And we know for sure that that is a check-the-box thing that's going to happen, as well as heavier floods, more hail events, cooler temperatures. All right, those are just check the boxes. Check, check, check. You know this is going to happen. Now, how is our society going to adjust to this? That's the big question. Well, what's happening right now is I foresee in the grains, the way they're spiking, and they're talking about massive losses, 13 million acres not planted. But, that's just an estimate. These guys are racing, guys and girls farmers, they're racing to get into what they call wet planting right now. So let me explain the wet planting. For the U.S. crop insurance program, this is the U.S. government insurance program, not private. They have to have their grain in the ground no later than the first week, the 7th of June. Then they can claim the loss. Well, what's happening right now is fields are flooded 2-3 feet deep in water. They're going to run through and till it and plant it in that water just so they can get the crop insurance. It's called wet planting.
TrueLeafMarket.com. I really want to talk about growing your own food, which will be a necessity moving forward. There's so many ways that we can go about growing different types of vegetables that we're going to need. Microgreens are incredibly nutritious. They're super fast to grow. In less than a week, you can have something that you can eat. Also sprouts. We can get those a little bit taller, a little more dense, a little bit larger volume on the vegetation mass coming off of there. So how do you know what kind of sprouts to grow? How about wheatgrass or herbs? What about different types of herbs that we can add to our foods? Now, what I just described to you, there's a full range of starter guides there at trueleafmarket.com for you to take a look at. Even if it's just for your own knowledge and you don't purchase something from them, at least get the information so you know how to grow microgreens, you know how to grow sprouts, you understand what some of the herbs are for. TrueLeafMarket.com. Use the link below and give yourself the gift of organic and heirloom seeds.
Now, for me, it makes no sense. Why wouldn't the U.S. government just go, all right, we know you can't plant, save your energy, save your seed, save your investment, we'll still pay you. But under the current law, they have to plant wet in order to get the crop insurance from the U.S. government. The private insurers have all been bankrupted. They're asking for government bailouts due to the inability to pay because there's so many claims at the same time. Private insurers aren't going to be able to do anything this year, and they've actually stopped insuring in so many places because they know the losses will bankrupt them again. This includes Canada and the United States. So there's no more private insurance for many areas where they're growing crops. They're all relying on the government now to pay the insurance claims. This makes no sense to me. Using resources, very valuable resources. But anyway, they're gonna get it. Now, this 13 million acres forecast by the USDA, I bet it's going to increase. What I see in terms of planting all the way from, let's say, Minnesota and the Dakotas, up in the Canadian border, all the way down through the Midwest grow belt, they're probably going to be around 5 to 15 million offline. Now, there's a mega drought and super incredible hot temperatures down in the southeast U.S., but they keep getting the rain, which is the only saving grace. If the rain stops in the southeast U.S., the soybean crop is gone for the year, as well as peanut. The rice crop also down in Arkansas, they can't plant. It's too flooding. Now, again, Arkansas River is hitting the all-time record flood stage. So let me dive into what I was working on here as a report. If you haven't seen the National Weather Service, they have issued the all-time record flood stages for the Arkansas River ever recorded. This goes back to the 1850s, and they're breaking every record that's ever been set. And you have to realize that Arkansas is a major, major rice producer. So at least 12% of the global rice production comes out of the United States at the minimum. And as it looks right now, these massive floods in Arkansas, they're not going to be able to plant the rice, which is going to pull on global supplies. It's going to be a total loss down there. Now, again, when I say wet plant, I'm talking more about corn and wheat and soya that goes into dry soils. Rice is a different thing because they're planting in water. Well, there's different varieties where you can till it in wet, you can till it in dry, then you can fill up the field, then it can go. But there's different types that you need to plant wet anyway. So it'd probably be like flood planting versus wet planting. I look at these pictures here, and it's just, if it wasn't flooded like it was up in, Nebraska and Iowa, it's just as far as you can see, it's just water. If it's not on a hill, it's covered in water. Then I look at the crypto markets here following along with that, and with all these huge, massive spikes happening in the futures market, they've pulled back. And what I notice, what's really interesting here, if you go to TradingView and you take a look at the crypto prices on Bitcoin, it spiked up yesterday at the same time that all the futures markets prices crept up. And then it all pulled back in the exact same time. So the crypto market was following the traditional futures and trading market as well. So somebody was electronic pumping and dumping on that to try to bring the price up and exit sell. But what I found most interesting, not only did the volume, but the prices follow exactly with the volumes and the prices inside the futures markets. So even though it's showing red across the board today, everybody was what they call profit taking because there was all paper trading out there too based on, and you know what, if the media is all focusing on corn and telling you, look, corn, you got to be looking at other things like the soft wheat, hard red winter wheat, spring wheat, because the entire media infrastructure was focused toward corn. They wanted you to see corn. They focused on corn. They wanted you to get in there. They wanted you to see it. But what was going on behind the scenes in the wheat market? Because that's where you got to look. So if you really come out and see this, the entire media infrastructure is pointing toward one single crop. You need to look at the other crops that are out there because, like, for example, March 21 call's up $17. And again, when you look at the July 19 call, it was up $18 yesterday. It's down $8 today, so that's still $10 over. Whatever happened, there was a massive pump into this market over the last 2 days, driving prices to that. They hadn't seen spikes like this in years. So the whole thing that's really going to throw this in, and you can get a good gauge where our economy is going, is the carryover stocks on the new USDA report. If you can get a gauge on how much it dropped, you can get a gauge on how much time we have left before we go into global food insecurity, where two things are going to happen. Food prices are going to spike indefinitely until we get a good harvest coming back in. But we know through history that even during every grand solar minimum, every one over the last 7 or 8, taking us back to 2500 BC, we know for sure that there were terrible years for harvest where food prices would spike 4x up to 7x. But then we would get good harvests after that where the food prices would stabilize again and come down to near what we would see at today's levels. There's still a lot of movement in my personal opinion. This is not investment advice, but I'd say personally, just looking in the past, go take a look at the quotes and what happened during bad years. Go back to 1990s and take a look at the massive floods, what happened and the price spikes back then. It's just going to be a copy-paste 2.0. But generally, these prices that we've seen with the lowest, incredibly super low prices had to have been a manipulated thing because prices have never really gotten this low. It's the lowest they've ever been in history. And now, up and up. So somebody, A, took these prices down on a coordinated effort across all financial markets, massive movements of money. They pegged the prices as low as it could possibly get, and now everything's spiking, so they picked it up at 380, and now it's already at 4 something. And then wheat as well, it went down, what was it, like 410, and now it's at 5. We got to realize these contracts are going out on 50 tons, so what, like 1,900 bushels? So if you're in cahoots with the USDA and you know what their releases are going to be, like somebody knew they were going to release that information about bumping that non-planting acreage from 4 million to 13 million. Like that is purely insider trading. Somebody knew that was coming. But anyway.
This video is brought to you by our friends at TrueLeafMarket.com. Heirloom and organic seeds for any grow zone on our planet.